In this video, we'll cover one of the least talked about, most underused, but probably the most versatile options of the Profiler platform. It's called Events. Events are accessed through the top menu bar. So when we talk about events, we'll be talking about the context of events within channels. So when we click the event icon, we go to the next screen and you'll see that there are 8 channels. 4 high power channels and 4 low power channels. The 4 high power channels are indicated by double lightning bolts. Some have green, some are red. The red signifies positive output, the green signifies negative output. There are 4 30 amp circuits available. 3 positive output, 1 negative output. There are 8 events within each channel. There are 4 low power channels. 1 lightning bolt, green, which signifies a negative output. And these are 4 750 milliamp circuits. And again, there are 8 events within each channel. Notice also to the right of the screen data-driven graphics that visually indicate your event programming. Before moving on to program an event, there's some important details that we need to talk about. When configuring events, be aware of the following. When you're using RPM as triggers, high power events have an accuracy of plus or minus 10 RPM. High power events can be pulsed, ramped, or progressed. Low power events have an accuracy of plus or minus 75 RPM and cannot be pulsed, ramped, or progressed. Also, when configuring events, be aware of the following. Events will end at whatever the max time setting is unless canceled by a TPS cancel or end time setting. Max time setting is configured on the main programming screen of the Profiler software. Throttle position sensor setting has several options. If it's set to cancel, for instance, when pedaling the car, or when there's a specific end time, when either one of those occurs, the event will end. So let's look at a HP or high power channel I have programmed for managing water injection, and then break down each event parameter setting. When I select the channel, notice there are 8 events within each channel. This means I have the ability to program up to 8 event actions within each of the channels during a run. Each action has multiple trigger options based upon button actuation, time, driveshaft RPM, or engine RPM. In this case, we named the channel water injection. Notice that I have pulsed at 18 Hertz. So depending on the solenoid that's being used, this means I want to progress the circuit as it comes on. So I'm going to pulse the solenoid in this case. Could be a nitrous circuit, could be anything that we want to gradually bring on or turn off, if you will. So in this case I've set it at 18 Hertz because I just know from experience that this particular solenoid progresses well at that Hertz setting. We look here at the channel can be disabled or enabled. So let's say I have an event programmed and maybe the next run I don't want to use that, so I can turn it off. Enable is simply by selecting enable, or if you want to disable, selecting that. Power up state could be on, selected to on or off. Power up state means when I turn power on to the profiler box. So as soon as I turn the power on to the box, or maybe to the car, that means whatever I have programmed, I want that to be on. For the next few minutes we'll talk about an area up here at the top that has to do with pre-launch. Pre-launch would be described as the profiler is powered on, but we haven't launched the car yet. So in other words, we haven't released the trans brake. So let's take a look at a few of these pre-launch options. First, let's define what pre-launch state is. Pre-launch means the profiler is powered on, it's armed, and we're on the trans brake. So over on the left you'll see one of the parameters, pre-launch only when armed. If checked, this enables the event that we're programming to occur when the profiler is on the trans brake. Pre-launch state means what is the duty cycle in Hertz, such as maybe pulsing a solenoid for a ramped event, or do we just want to turn it on, which in this case we'd set to 100%. Otherwise we would set it in Hertz. Pre-launch RPM means that engine RPM must be reached for this event to start. Parameter to cancel the event, so that in other words the pre-launch cancel, you'll see at the bottom of the window. This one's a little bit harder to understand, the way it's programmed. So if the entry in the window is set to 3999 or less, the parameter is in milliseconds. You'll notice there's a MS to the right of that box. 3999 in milliseconds is 3.999 seconds. If the parameter that you enter is greater than 3999, then the parameter means engine RPM. Notice the bottom box there, there's an RPM after the window, so it will graphically show you what it's interpreting as your entry. So there's a couple of other items that are related to pre-launch events that you need to be aware of. If the event is a timing retard, you need to go to the System Options tab, which is located at the top of the Profiler software screen, and it opens the System Options window as you see here on the left, and one of the items in there is PL ramp, in and out. PL stands for pre-launch. Ramp in and out refers to the rate that we're going to ramp our timing in and out, and it's timing advance rate in degrees per second. For example, if there was an entry of 50, that stands for 50 degrees per second, or 5 degrees per tenth of a second. Another item that's right above that is called button lockout. So if you're using a button to trigger this event, you set the lockout time in the window as shown. That keeps you from accidentally activating that event more than once by locking out the button by the time period that you have entered in the window. So what would I use pre-launch for? Some examples might be to bleed converter pressure. Might be in a blower car to use it for fuel lean outs. Maybe in a turbo car to control boost pressure, timing retard, and as it says on the slide, use your imagination. Okay, the next section is called TPS mode, or throttle position sensor mode. So if I pedal the car during a run, what do I want this event to do? Do I want to just disable TPS mode? Do I want to restart at 0.0? So in other words, I pedal the car, it'll restart at 0. Do I want to restart at event 1? So event 1 is over here, so it would restart at 3.8 seconds. Or do I want it to restart at event 2, which is at 4.15 seconds in this case? Do I want it to resume? So in other words, if I'm part way through my run and I pedal the car and I get full throttle again, it will resume from the point that it was when I pedaled the car. Or when I pedal the car, do I want to cancel the event? So it could be something like a converter lockup, for instance. Maybe I figure if I have to pedal the car during a run, maybe I don't want it to lock up again right away, so I'll just have it cancel the event since the run was probably going to be aborted anyway. Okay, let's do a quick review of the programming we've done so far in event number 1. Again, this was the water injection. We want to pulse the solenoid at 18 Hertz. We're going to enable the channel. We want the power up state to be off. We don't want this to become active until we start our run. Pre-launch only when armed. We're not going to use pre-launch in this case, so we can turn it off, and we've got all the parameters for pre-launch zeroed out. And in the throttle position switch mode, if we pedal the car, we want water injection to resume wherever it's at in the run. So let's go over here to event 1. So we want to turn the water injection on, in this case, at 3.8 seconds. Notice down here below in this window, this gives you a graphical representation of everything that we're going to program in this event. So we said we want it on at 3.8 seconds, so it shows the signal here. It starts at 3.8 seconds, and we're progressing this solenoid, or progressing this event. So we want to progress it from 3.8 to 4.4 seconds, so 4/10 of a second. If I wanted to change the off from 4.4 to 5 seconds, for instance, I'll change it up here to 5 seconds, and notice that it changed down here just like we entered up here. It's going to ramp to 5 seconds. So it's a good check of your work to be able to graphically show this, make sure you haven't made any mistakes. Let's go back up here to duty cycle. So we want 100% duty cycle, so we entered 100 in here. We want this to be a ramped event, so in other words a progressed event, which it shows here at the bottom in the window. So what's our trigger condition? Our trigger condition can be no triggers, which means I'm going to do this just on time. It can be button only, and we'll talk about what a button is here in a minute. It can be RPM only, which is what I have selected here, or it can be button or RPM. I've set a window of between 3.8 and 5 seconds. So what this says is that the RPM has to be above 5,000 RPM for this event to start. It has to be above 5,000, and it has to be within the window of 3.8 to 5 seconds. So as long as it's above 5,000, as soon as I hit 3.8 seconds, it's going to start my event. RPM source can be drive shaft or engine. In this case, we're going to use engine. And what am I going to do? What kind of a trigger mode? Am I going to start the event in the event, and there's an option here for shift light. We'll talk about what that is. And then I can also use this to trigger a retard if I wanted to. In this case we're not, and we want to start the event. So this portion of the programming is done. We've started the event. Now we've got it up to 5 seconds. So this is what we call a linked event. So I've got event 1, which is going to pulse the solenoid. It's going to ramp it from 3.8 to 5 seconds. So now we need to continue on with event 2. We've ramped to 5 seconds. So now we need to define what we want to do from 5 seconds to the end of the run. Now this is what we call a linked event. Notice the fonts on the screen are green off at 5, and it's also green on at 5. So we want to start event 2. It's a continuation, so we'll start it at 5 seconds, and we'll continue on to 7 seconds, which is going to be the end of the run or whenever the throttle is lifted, and that will automatically end the run. Notice that we're not using a ramped event this time. We've already ramped it to 5 seconds, so we just want it on at 100% duty cycle the rest of the pass. The trigger condition is going to be RPM only again, so between 5 and 7 seconds, we assume at 5 seconds our engine RPM is going to be above 5,000. So we set it at 5,000 above, engine RPM again, and the trigger mode is start. So this completes the programming for this event. Well, programming events, one of the most common questions seems to be about the button trigger. When we talk about a button, normally we're referring to the bump button. In the case of the profiler, we can use a single button to activate more than one event. A button is normally only used for a single event, such as a bump, for instance. But now we've got the capability to use that same button before or during other parts of the run, or even prior to the run. As a side note, the button channel that's defined in the System Options menu is only prior to pre-launch. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes along with the last 2 bullets that are on this slide. So in this example, we'll use the button to activate the air chute system. In this case, we only want to be able to activate the chutes after 4 seconds until the end of the pass. So we named it chutes. We're turning the window on at 4 seconds and off at 7 seconds, or at the end of the run. Our duty cycle is 100%. It's not a ramped event, and in this case we're using button only. So I can use the bump button when I'm launching the car, and then at 4 seconds, next time I push that button, it's going to launch the air chutes. So we've set the trigger mode, in this case, to shift light, because we only want the signal just when we push the button. And then we want to turn it back off as we release the button. So what other things could I use this for? I could use it to possibly shift the transmission during a burnout, or maybe short shift it during a run after I've launched the car. Activate a nitrous kit maybe. Maybe a fuel lean out in the case of a blower system. Maybe trigger a retard. Any number of things. Here's a few more details that you need to be aware of while programming using a button trigger. There's a setting in the System Options window regarding the button. The button channel assigned here refers to the button that's used during a burnout. For instance, maybe to shift the transmission, so the box is not armed nor on the trans brake. Button triggers can be used on multiple channels. A note of caution: if multiple channels have a button trigger, be careful using your window setting times, as a button may activate more than one channel at a time. So if you've got the same window of time in multiple channels and you push that button, it's going to activate both of those channels. So just be aware of that. If the trigger condition is set to button or RPM and the trigger mode is set to shift light, the channel will output while the button is pushed, and again when the RPM setting is passed. So think of the shift light trigger. Works just like a shift light. If you exceed the RPM, it's going to turn it on. Same applies here. If the trigger mode is set to start or end, then the first trigger is the only one that will be seen or activated. So let's program a couple of more channels to demonstrate the power and flexibility of this program. In this case, we'll set up an air shifter where we want to shift the 1-2 on time, and we want to shift the 2-3 based on an RPM. So we'll use a low power channel because we have a low amperage draw solenoid on our shifter, and we'll name the channel shifter. And we enable the channel because we want to make it available. Select the power up state to be off because we don't want to start the event until after we release the trans brake. We're not going to use any pre-launch functions, so we ignore that. And I set the throttle position sensor mode to resume. So if the car is pedaled, the shifter event will just continue on as it was before we pedaled the car. So we go down to event 1. In this case, I want to shift the car on time for the 1-2 gear change. So I set the on time at 1.27 seconds in this case. I know there's a little bit of a delay after the trigger point, but I know from previous experience how long that period is. So I want to select my trigger at 1.27 seconds. And because it's on time only, my trigger condition is set to no triggers. And that completes starting the event number 1. I want my 2-3 gear change to be based on RPM. So in this case, I know my 2-3 gear change is normally between 2.25 and 4 seconds. So I set up a window, a time window, 2.25 to 4 seconds, and my trigger condition in this case is set to RPM only. And I want the RPM to be 7150, engine RPM. So when the engine reaches 7150, it should trigger my 2-3 gear change. So again, the RPM source is engine, and my trigger mode is shift light because it's just going to be a momentary signal to the shifter. I can look down here below just to verify that I have the settings like I want them. So again, we had our first event on at 1.27, and in the second part of the event I set up the window between 2.5 and 4 seconds, and I have the engine RPM at 7150. So that completes setting up the air shifter. Let's program one more channel, this time being the lockup converter. This will really show the flexibility of the events program. One of the challenges of running a lockup converter in a nitrous car is keeping the engine RPM high enough where it doesn't cause problems with the engine. If you get down below about 6,000 RPM, it's bad juju for a nitrous engine. So let's go through and start from the beginning. So I've got another high-powered channel, and I named it lockup. I'm enabling that channel. My power-up state is off, again because I don't want to start the timer until release of the trans brake. I'm not using any pre-launch capabilities. I'm setting the TPS mode to cancel because I want the lockup to turn off if the car is pedaled. We've probably already aborted the run at that point anyway. So we'll go over here to event 1. I'm going to turn the lockup on at 1.8 seconds. I'll be triggering the lockup at 1.8. It takes actually about 0.5 to 0.6 of a second to completely lock up. I'm setting the off at 2, and we'll explain this a little bit later. I'm setting the duty cycle to 100% because I just want to turn it on with no progression. And I'm setting it to RPM only, and I'm setting my RPM at 6,300. So if I'm in at 1.8 and I'm above 6,300 RPM, my lockup should come on. And the trigger mode in this case again is set to start. I go to event 2, which is a continuation or a linked event from event 1. As you can see, I've got off at 2 on event 1, and I've got on at 2 at event 2. And I've got off in this case at 2.9 seconds. So what I want to do here is actually turn the lockup off just prior to the 2-3 gear change. I've got it set to 100% again. I've got my RPM only, and I've got it set at 7550. So what will happen in this case, because I have the trigger mode set to end, when the engine RPM gets to 7550, I'm going to unlock the converter. The car will make the 2-3 gear change, and then I want to turn the lockup back on. But when I turn it back on, I want to ensure that I'm above 6,000 RPM. Now let's use event 3 to turn the lockup back on. So our gear change occurs slightly before 3.25 seconds. So now I set up a window beginning at 3.25 to the end of the run. In this case, I set it at 6.5 seconds, or whenever the end of the run occurs, which should be slightly before that. My duty cycle is at 100%. We're using RPM only. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to keep our engine RPM above 6,000 RPM, at least in our case. So I've set this at 6,300. I'm using RPM source as engine, and the trigger mode is shift light. What shift light will do is when the converter locks back up again after the gear change, if it pulls the engine down below 6,300, it will temporarily unlock the converter. Once the engine RPM climbs above 6,300, it will lock it back up again automatically. This demonstrates how we have complete control over this lockup event under varying conditions. Let's look below to verify our settings. One thing I failed to mention earlier is that all high power events will have a red line trace for the graphs, and all low power events you'll see in green. So you can quickly visually see, just to verify that you programmed a high or low power event. So we've got our lockup event that we started at 1.8 seconds, and we went to 2 seconds, but then we continued on with event 2 at the 2 seconds, and notice we have a dashed line which signifies that there's a condition involved, which is 7550. So at 7550 we're going to turn off our event 2, and then we'll turn it back on at 3.25 seconds until the end of the run. There's a couple of other items that we want to look at before we leave events. If we go up here to the Events tab, there's a couple of options over here that we haven't talked about. The first one is Show Event Charts. So I programmed all my events, and it gives me a summary, visual summary of what I have programmed in the system. So in this case, I'm using these selected channels. It shows me which events, 1 through 8. Plus it gives me the graphical representation of each one of these events that I've programmed. Event 3 here that doesn't show a line on there is being used for the trans break. That's why it appears to be blank, but it is being used. And then if we want to save our events settings, I can go up here and select Save Event Settings, so I don't have to reprogram these. Let's say I create a new profile and I want to use the same events and settings that I just programmed in another profile. I can save those out to the profiler library and then import those settings into my new profile that I'm creating. This saves a lot of time, duplication of effort, and the chance of making an error.